Expanded BRICS is set to de-dollarize the world and control global energy supply. This is authored by Darren Taylor via Epoch Times. The expansion of BRICS has made it clear that the de-dollarization of the international finance system is inevitable. This view from economist William Gumed, who's also executive chairperson of the Democracy Works Foundation in South Africa. He's echoed around the world since BRICS leaders announced the expansion of the bloc on August 24 at a summit in Johannesburg, South Africa. Current BRICS members are Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. BRICS for short. In January, BRICS, originally established in 2009 to represent the world's strongest emerging market economies, will add Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates to its ranks. Mr. Gumed, one of South Africa's leading academics and thought leaders, has been researching the potential impacts of de-dollarization since 2014. He said that the average per capita GDP of the G7 economies was currently 6 times that of BRICS economies, but the unexpectedly swift expansion of BRICS would increase the trade's bloc share of the global economy much faster than earlier predictions. He said these forecasts did not take into account that BRICS would expand its membership very quickly. A larger BRICS will mean the world will increasingly use US dollars less. Mr. Gumed said that bigger BRICS alliance would eventually rival the group of G7, large industrial economies of the United States, European Union, United Kingdom, France, Japan, Italy, and Canada, which together are home to 16% of the world's population and account for 62% of the global economy. Welcoming the new members in Johannesburg last week, Brazil President Lula da Silva said that their addition would mean BRICS would represent 46% of the global population and 37% of the world GDP. The expansion means BRICS now consists of some of the globe's largest oil producers. Russia, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Egypt, Nigeria, and other major oil exporters is set to join when the bloc gets even bigger, probably at its next summit in Russia in 2024. BRICS is going to dominate the world's energy supply, said Gumed. The strength of the US dollar is also partially based on the currency, as underpinning oil trade, the so-called petrodollar, and members of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, settle their accounts in US dollars. Therefore, enlarging BRICS is also to include the oil producers and persuading them to use a new BRICS currency rather than the US dollar to settle their accounts will be a game changer. It's likely to accelerate the de-dollarization of the world, he said. Jackie Cilliers, head of African Futures, an innovative program of the Institute of Security Studies in Pretoria, South Africa, attributed the unexpectedly rapid expansion of BRICS and its moves towards de-dollarization to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its consequences. BRICS has seen the West hit Russia with all kinds of financial sanctions and threaten sanctions against South Africa for supposedly supporting Russia, and as a result, it wants to end or at least ease its dependence on the dollar, he said. De-dollarization, first mooted by Russian President Vladimir Putin as a potent symbol of a shift away from Western-led global order towards a new era of more uncertain and fluid multipolar connections, changes in the air, and the next 3 decades will see the steady unfolding of this trend. Mr. Cilliers said BRICS was cloaking itself in resentment against the West. It's quite easy for Russia and China to take advantage of the ill feeling that still exists across much of the developing world because of colonialism, imperialism, and sanctions by leading Western countries. And he commented, never mind the fact that Russia and China show similar imperialistic tendencies. He said the Global South was particularly unhappy with international finance institutions and with the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank. Cilliers said, when the Fed hikes interest rates, it sometimes sends smaller economies into turmoil They're subject to shocks for no domestic reason, so they see the dollar as providing the United States with a very powerful weapon to use in its interests. This is what unites BRICS in its desire to move away from the dollar-backed international financial system. But, he said, de-dollarization was going to be a slow process. Trade among BRICS countries is too small to sustain a common currency, and it only makes sense to trade in national currencies if the trade balance between the countries is more or less equal, which it most definitely is not likely to be in the near future. Mr. Gomed pointed to a recent example of Russia selling a lot of oil to India. They dealt in rupees, but because India exports much less to Russia than it imports, Russia now sits with rupees it can't spend or convert, except to buy goods from India. Mr. Sellier said China's renminbi was also sufficiently convertible and lacked deep capital markets, market transparency, independent central banks, and supported financial institutions of Western banks. He said there were also perceptions of risk associated with China's future. It is, after all, a repressive autocracy. It'll battle to maintain stability in the face of slower economic growth. I'd also be very surprised if India supports a common BRICS currency, given its concerns about China as a regional and potential global competitor. Mr. Gumit said the euro, a common currency, is stable because it's underpinned by stable political regime in a stable part of the world. Wherever you look in BRICS, there is instability, like in Russia because of the Ukraine war. What would happen to the BRICS currency if China invades Taiwan? Mr. Sellier predicts that rather than a single alternative to the dollar, new currency blocks would emerge. These will be based on bilateral and multilateral trade among the Middle East, China, South America, West Africa, and elsewhere, and so we'll see the power of the dollar slowly wane, he said. Sellier said the most important shift in the power of the greenback would happen once oil and gas prices were no longer set in US dollars. This is probably the motivation behind inclusion of Saudi Arabia and the UAE in the expanded BRICS, he said. Mr. Gannett said demand for US dollars would remain high as long as US GDP was close to 25% of the global economy. He said President Putin, supported by China's leader Xi Jinping, was pushing so hard for de-dollarization because it's key to the economic survival of Russia following Western sanctions. The West froze $300 billion of Russia's foreign trade reserves after it invaded Ukraine in February 2022, and its foreign trade transactions, including those with some emerging markets, have been blocked. 7 of Russia's banks have been excluded from the world's leading international payment messaging system, SWIFT. The ban means Russian banks cannot do digital cross-border transactions. However, Russia banks do transactions connection to oil and gas are exempt from SWIFT ban, and this is preventing the Russian economy from collapsing, said Gomed. Russia is the world's 3rd largest oil producer, but is the largest exporter of oil. BRICS countries have been buying oil and gas from Moscow, insulating Russia against isolation by the United States and the EU, Gomed said. For example, Indian imports of Russia oil in May 2023 reached record levels of about 1.95 million barrels a day. That's almost 2 million barrels a day of Russian oil coming in to India. Now, according to International Energy Agency, China and India bought 80% of Russia's oil in May, with China buying 2.2 million barrels a day. Leslie Mastrup, Chief Financial Officer of the BRICS Financial Mechanism, the new development bank, told the Epoch Times BRICS countries were prepared to conduct business with one another in domestic currencies. But he added they were not yet ready to issue a common currency that could challenge the dollar. Mastrup said the creation of a global alternative currency to the dollar is a medium to long-term ambition rather than an immediate possibility. Even the Chinese renminbi is very far from becoming a global reserve currency. Sellier said it was also likely that intensifying rivalry between China and India would slow the de-dollarization. He said India has already said it wants to focus on strengthening its own currency ahead of anything else. Mr. Sellier suggested that the expansion of BRICS now and in the future should not be seen as an automatic sign that developing countries were untying behind a simplistic common vision of overthrowing the West. Many people have this view that if Russia and China in particular snap their fingers and say de-dollarize now, that other BRICS countries are just going to listen to the master's voice. Believe me, there's a deep resentment within BRICS and within the wider global South about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the harm it continues to sow in developing countries, causing inflation spikes, for example, and even grain shortages. Countries' motivations for wanting to join BRICS differ, but what stays the same is that few, if any, global South nations will exchange one hegemon with another. And this is on Zero Hedge by Tyler Durden, authored by Darren Taylor of the Epoch Times. Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Finally, support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.